If your free weight squat looks something like this, but you would much rather it look something more like this, then I'm going to give you 3 solutions in this video to basically make sure that this is not what your squat looks like. And the title of this video is actually 0% clickbait, because these solutions are actually instant fix solutions, because they're simply just based on fundamental physics that can change the way that we're actually interacting with the forces in a squat. So the first and most obvious solution of this is kind of what your squat looks like is to put something under your heel. In other words, use a heel elevation. Now, a heel elevation can come in many forms. You could use a wedge from a particular company. You could use a plate or some kind of box, like low-level box, or some kind of wooden plank underneath of your heels. And what this will actually do is it will effectively move your center of mass forward. It kind of forces you a little bit more on your toes so that you can more readily sit backward and more deeply into the squat. A simple way to think about this is imagine what happens when you're walking down a steep hill. Right? When you walk down a steep hill, you kind of have to lean your center of mass backward such that you don't actually fall forward and all the way down the hill. That would be problematic. And so in the same sense, if you find that as you tried to go deeper into the squat, you're falling backward, what you would want to do is mimic that sort of pattern of what the hill is doing to your feet. In other words, putting more of your weight onto the balls of your feet and elevating your heels so that you can then sit backward and sit more straight up to down. And that, to be honest, out of all the solutions here, is going to be the simplest and likely most effective. Now, for reference, most people are probably going to need a heel elevation on average between 10 and 30 degrees, something like that. So I would just experiment around with something that feels comfortable for you. And a very simple way to actually do this is basically just to hold on to something in front of you and squat down on the balls of your feet. And then basically just observe, okay, like what size thing would I need to put underneath of my heels to kind of mimic this same pattern? That'll be the quickest, easiest solution. What's solution number 2? Solution number 2 is simply to alter the stance, and specifically the stance from the perspective of the feet and the orientation of the feet. So a lot of times when we're doing narrow types of squats, and let's just assume for now that we're not using a heel elevation, maybe you find it uncomfortable, impractical, whatever it happens to be, that's perfectly fine. You can change your stance. And when we're doing sort of narrow squats, what happens is our femurs, our legs kind of get in the way, right? Our belly sort of runs into our legs. It makes it maybe uncomfortable to continue to sit further down. But when we orient the toes a little bit outward and we move our stance a little bit wider, that gives us an ability to do 2 things. Number 1 is it gives us an ability to sort of sit between our hips more easily. And the reason that happens is because of number 2, which effectively comes from directing our legs inward to outward as opposed to straight forward and backward. So think about it this way. If I were going to raise my arm in this forward to backward direction, you would see that, you're observing the entire length of my arm. But when I move it, let's say, 50 or 60 degrees this way, now you're no longer observing this entire length of my arm from the perspective of you all watching from the camera, right? What you see is only a fraction of the length of my arm. And basically what that means in the context of the squat is you're effectively shortening the femurs because you're allowing them to be directed outward. In other words, they're not traveling forward to backward where you may have to end up sort of folding more like this. And so from the perspective of the side, what moving the legs outward and pointing them outward actually does is it effectively shortens the length of the femur. And as many of you may or may not know, people generally with shorter relative femurs have an easier time moving up to down because they have an easier time balancing over their midfoot as they fold all of these segments together. So solution number 3 is simply to alter the load. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, generally speaking, when people are doing free weight squats, they're putting something on their back and the load of that bar has to fall directly through the midfoot because, again, we don't want to fall forward and we don't want to fall backward. But a big limitation of this is sort of what we've talked about so far, which is that because you have to center all of your mass around the middle of your foot or else fall forward or backward, you basically have to use these segments in a way that allows you to do that. But if instead of putting the bar on our back, whether it's in a more high bar position or a low bar position, you can also put the load a little bit more forward. And when we put the load a little bit more forward, i.e. in something like a front squat or a goblet squat, or if you have a specialty bar like a safety bar where you can actually move the load forward, What this will do is, think back to number one, is it will distribute more load forward. So what happens when we have more load forward is we actually get an ability to sort of, much like walking down the hill, lean a little bit backward against this load that is trying to smush us into the floor. And so interestingly, a lot of people can go from a back squat to a front squat and see so much more depth, not because they magically just improve their mobility, but because they simply change the force scenario that they were interacting with when they were trying to do the squat. And so a lot of people, I think, get this false perception that they squat like this because they're super limited in mobility, rather than understanding that a lot of this is merely just a constrained consequence of you having to balance something over the middle of your foot. So these three solutions together, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. Altogether, you could use a heel elevation, you could use a little bit of a toed out wider stance, and you could load a little bit more in front of you, and all these things would make it infinitely easier to squat down to a degree that maybe you want to for whatever reason. Maybe it's because you just simply want to work through a greater total range. Maybe you just like the feeling of squatting more deeply. Whether or not that's in line with a more specific goal will be specific to the context. So for example, if you were doing a front squat, okay, to sort of provide maybe a counterpoint here, if you were doing a front squat, right, where is the load distributed? Again, it's farther away from you forward, which means that it's farther away from your hips. And so some of you may notice that maybe you feel an improved amount of quad contraction with the front squat, just because you're getting so much more range of motion into that deep position. But eventually, maybe other things start to limit you, right? Like maybe you start to kick your hips back more because, again, the load is farther away from your hips. Maybe you feel like your back is caving in because there's just too much load for you to hold. In that case, what I would recommend is something more maybe on your back and utilizing one of these two things longer term as you progress more and more load. But if you or any of your clients, if you're a coach or a trainer, are struggling with this concept of depth, all these three variables, whether you use one of them, two of them, or all three of them simultaneously, can really, really help, not just to sort of eventually fix a squat to be more deep, but literally instantly. Like when you make these changes, you'll notice that your body and the physics around your body change to basically make it so much easier to squat more deeply. So try out any of these changes or all of them and let me know how they go. I hope this was helpful.